Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Hi, and welcome to an episode of Collegial Conversations. I am Diana Clark, and my guest today is Cali Werner, and we're going to be talking about obsessive-compulsive disorder, perfectionism, and athletics. Welcome, Cali. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here to jump into a topic I'm extremely passionate about, so it should be a great time.
So first, I want to get a little bit of background. What compels you to do this particular work and why this?
Yeah, so honestly, I thought I was going to be a sports reporter when I was in college. I competed collegiately in cross country and track. And when I started having more success in college, I really started struggling with a lot of anxiety, perfectionism, and OCD without a diagnosis. And the OCD in particular became debilitating. And it wasn't until I got the appropriate level of care that it was pretty life-changing for me. And so decided to totally change my career trajectory. And now I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have private practice where I work with athletes with OCD and anxiety. And then I also do intensive work at the OCD Institute of Texas, located in the Heights. So yeah, love it, passionate about it. And it's been a journey, but I'm glad to be here now.
Yay. So I can give you a personal story. I like to think I used to run marathons. And in my 20s, I like to think that I ran myself relatively well. I had a good therapist, but it was in the running that I got well. That's what
Yeah, and I think that just like with any, mindfulness activities, things that we love, there's joy that comes with that and peace that's brought with it. And for me, I can now say that my running is in a healthy place, but there's this trajectory, I guess, or this scale that you want to stay within. And I got a little bit outside that scale. So it was like, if I'm running 6 miles, I might as well run 8 miles because I hate the number 6. And,
so that would have been a numeric.
Right.
Got it.
So if it's in that healthy zone, absolutely, it can help. But for me, my exposure work was often, no, today you have to take a day off and you're not going to engage in any exercise. And instead you're going to walk your dog and sit with that anxiety.
That was your exposure. So how does work with athletes actually differ from working with other people at OCDI or OCD?
Yeah. That's a great question. So with a lot of athletes, there's this desire to compete and to compete well. And if they struggle with perfectionism, and I ask them to do something imperfectly, there's a big kind of bad taste in their mouth of, well, I don't want this to negatively disrupt my sport. And so I would say there's a little bit more space where we need to be engaging in education of how these perfectionistic behaviors or these OCD behaviors are actually only going to be detrimental to your sport long term. If you want to pull everything out of yourself for this one season, then okay, maybe that can be helpful. But if you want to be a basketball player for the next 4 years, if you want to, be a distance runner for after collegiate athletics, this isn't sustainable. And so it's a lot of like teaching them of the cost benefit. Whereas I would say if someone doesn't have that intensive a goal, you do need to spend some time on education, but you might not be spending as much.
So give me a little bit of what would it look like? What would the behaviors look like for somebody who is an athlete and also struggling with OCD? You described your own 6 to 8 or whatever, but what are other situations?
Yeah. So there's actually 8 different subtypes of OCD, and they're all pretty, from what the research says, equally as common. We know a little bit less about some of the taboo subtypes of OCD, but if you go on the peaceofmind.com website, there's a list of all the different subtypes with great information. But we've got, let's say an athlete struggles with magical thinking, and that's the form of OCD where an athlete is engaging in a lot of rituals that might be, I can't wear this color or I'll have a bad game, or kind of similar with me, like 8 was a good number, 6 was a bad number, all of these superstitious behaviors. Whereas I will say a lot of athletes without OCD have superstitious
I was
behaviors.
going to say, you hear about the
I
man
knew it was
who
coming.
changed his jersey for 10 years because it was a good.
Right. And that's the difference. So if we looked at the OCD symptom checklist, I would say almost everyone could probably say, oh, I do that, or, one or two of those things. But if that's all they're doing, like if, for example, I had to, when I was younger, double check the lock. And at first that was enough, but that double check became a triple check, became a quadruple check, to where I was taking pictures on my phone, looking at the phone to make sure it was locked. So it started to disrupt my daily life. And that's where a superstition becomes more of a superstition, or more than a superstition, right? Like I will say another example, one of my favorites, personal examples, was before races. If I ran well, I wanted to repeat that same thing. That's how any superstitious behavior gets started, right? So I ran well and I had 3 bobby pins in my hair. So I wanted to wear 3 bobby pins the next time. But then the next time I also thought, well, I used this shampoo and I listened to this song, and I then ended the shower on cold, and it just became overbearing, right? And that's where we have to start slowly exposing the individual to those fears of, yeah, you're not going to do that, and let's go race. And then that can kind of give them their life back that the anxiety took away.
Right. Do you ever recommend that people cease the actual athletics, or is it more in the exposure of continuing to do it while not engaging in the behaviors?
Yeah. So I would say 9 times out of 10, I recommend they continue to play, because what we find is if we remove that sport or that thing that they're passionate about, it's the anxiety that's the problem. It's not the sport, right? So what's going to happen is it's just going to latch on to the next thing that they start to care about. Now, there's some instances where you want to spend more time with the athlete. This is another one of those examples that's different from working with an athlete versus a non-athlete, because sometimes their values really are not in line with playing the sport anymore. And that's pretty rare. Most of the time, an athlete that's really successful wants to do better, wants to engage in their sport. But if their values are like, no, it has nothing to do with my anxiety, I just don't love this sport anymore, I want to do something else, then yeah, we're going to honor their values. But I never want an athlete making a decision because anxiety is making it for them.
Because that in and of itself is the opposition or opposed.
Right. Avoidance. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
To ERP. Yeah. So what you mentioned magical thinking. What are some of the other ways OCD manifests?
The other more common ones that are known are contamination. So that's that excessive showering, hand washing, fear of certain chemicals, cleaning supplies. It can go all the way to like radiation fears. And then we've got the just right behaviors. So having to do something until you get this just right feeling, maybe like turning a light switch on and off over and over till you get that just right feeling. And I will say with this one, we get a lot of stigma, because some people will say, I'm so OCD, my office has to be perfectly in line. And no, that's you describing type A personality, right?
That's not OCD.
Right. The OCD is when we do this behavior because we feel like something bad will happen if we don't do it. Like if I don't put my Yeti cup or my Stanley face this way and it's leaning perfectly straight, then my loved one might die, or then I'm going to do bad on this exam. That's more OCD. There's also sexual intrusive thoughts, where an individual might be having these random thoughts pop up where they hug a loved one and they picture them with their shirt off and it's a family member, and it causes them a lot of distress and anxiety. And we have to get individuals to realize that we all have random intrusive thoughts, but the difference with someone with OCD is we're attaching extra meaning to it. So that one, and then harm OCD, are the ones that are talked about a little less, the taboo ones, because harm OCD can be this fear of either impulsively harming oneself or harming someone else. And I want to iterate over and over again that the individual with OCD is not likely to do either of these things, right? Just kind of like if I'm sitting on the second story of this building and I look out a window, I might have this random thought of jumping out the window, not even notice it. Right. Not notice it, go back to answering emails. But if I have harm OCD to self, then I think, why would I have a thought like that? Does that mean I want to harm myself? Should I avoid windows? Should I avoid sharp objects? And it becomes super debilitating and their world gets really small. But again, they're not at risk of doing that. And then we've got relationship OCD, where someone fears, am I in the right relationship? Do I love this person? Do I not love this person? And there can be a lot of reassurance seeking. And scrupulosity is the religious-based form of OCD, where someone might excessively pray or fear, there's certain religions where you can't eat pork or have to eat kosher. And so they might read ingredients for an hour before they read something, knowing that it's a food that doesn't actually have that ingredient. It's just very obsessive, very debilitating. And the last thing I'll say about that, I know this is a quick run through of all these, is that the individual with OCD usually knows these thoughts are irrational. They have a lot of insight into it, meaning that it's ego dystonic, but it's the anxiety that convinces them otherwise, right? So it's not that they really 100% believe they're going to jump out that window, or that they know that, no, this doesn't have kosher, but my anxiety is telling me that it doesn't have pork. My anxiety is telling me that it does. And so that's kind of the difference between, someone with OCD versus someone with another diagnosis, or having delusions or something along those lines.
Right. So it is that just in case. It's the just in case.
Yes.
This may not, but just in case. I could see that being sort of.
Yeah, it's like the brain is telling them they can't live with that 1% of not knowing. And so with the therapy that we do, we're trying to reintroduce, no, you actually live with that 1% every day, right? If you go to the grocery store, on your way to the store, you're thinking about getting eggs, milk, apples. You're not thinking about that 1% chance of getting in a car accident and not making it. So for some reason, with whatever the OCD thought latches onto, it tells them you can't handle that 1% anymore. So we have to kind of reteach the brain, create new neural pathways into, nope, you handled this before and you can handle it again.
Handle it again. I'm working with a client right now who is miraculous. She is, she had contamination issues and she is just thriving. I think that must be one of the exciting things about working with OCD, is that therapies work.
Yeah.
And can you give me a little bit of a success story? Tell me somebody.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's about that evidence-based therapy, right? So for sure, when I was in college, a lot of what I struggled with was scrupulosity, that fear of, is God going to be mad at me if I don't do this correctly? Or did I sin? Did I do this horrible thing? And I went to a couple of therapists that didn't do evidence-based practice. And so in one of or I should say evidence-based practice for OCD, because I'm sure that is evidence-based for a different diagnosis. But one of the therapists I was sent to was a hypnotherapist. And for OCD, there isn't research that shows that that's helpful. And so it just sent me in a spiral, and it was even worse than needed. And so for example, a lot of individuals will say, well, yeah, I do cognitive behavioral therapy, which is great for negative thinking, great for a lot of individuals, but it's not great if you're not including the ERP, because it can just be a form of reassurance for someone with OCD. So yeah, lots of, I worked in residential for severe OCD for a while, and that's really rewarding, right? Because you see individuals that are basically homebound, where a little bit at a time, they start to get some of their life back. And I even had some patient this week that said something like, I've got this free time back. And I was like, well, why do you have it back? And they said, well, I'm not doing all these cleaning compulsions anymore. I said, well, what are you doing with that free time? And they're engaging in a hobby that they hadn't touched in years. And that's such a cool, a great win for both of us to be able to experience.
Mm-hmm. So do you see OCD starting fairly young and maybe just ignored or just sort of reassured for many, many years, and then it blossoms? Or what's the usual trajectory?
Yeah, so I would say, it's some that have it their whole lives, and then some that they get the onset when they're in their early 20s, and it's the first time that it's ever shown up. There was a specific trigger. For me, once I finally got my diagnosis when I was 21, I could look back and make sense of so much of my childhood, because the compulsions began when I was as young as 3. I was going around my house, tapping my nose, saying, sorry, God, sorry, God, sorry, God, out of fear that I could have told a lie and my nose was going to grow like Pinocchio. And so, we've seen it in as young as 2 or 3-year-olds, but there's a lot of individuals that didn't have an onset until a stressful time in life, right? Like a move from a house or a divorce or COVID. A lot of individuals got the onset of contamination OCD after COVID, right? But I will say there is a genetic component, like a genetic predisposition. We don't know as much about like what percentage of that is genetic versus what is environmental, psychosocial. Because sometimes parents will hold this guilt of, well, if I just wouldn't have, gotten this divorce, would my kid not have OCD? And the reality is, no, they still would have. Life gets stressful regardless, right? It's just a matter of treating it earlier on, so that they can get those skills before life gets more stressful.
That's all right. I do think, is the incidence of OCD on the incline, or has it always been pretty much flat across the board? Do we know?
I think that the population percentage we're learning is more than what we initially thought, just because we didn't know as much about it before, right? It was so misdiagnosed. Someone with harm OCD that had no desire of harming themselves was diagnosed as suicidal, or with a mood disorder when really it was clear-cut OCD and they would have gotten it treated if they got the appropriate treatment. And so most research, for example, with the general population is saying 2 to 3% right now, which is about 1 in 50 of that general population experience OCD. But there's also new research coming out on, there was a study by Cromer and colleagues, I want to say in 2020, probably 2020, around that time, where she studied NCAA Division I athletes. And it turned out that the population of athletes experiencing OCD was over double that in this specific study compared to the general population. So we're learning more. There's still a long way to go, but we've come a long way too.
So you have an organization your practice is called?
Athlete Rising.
Athlete Rising. I like it. And what is the mission of Athlete Rising?
Yeah, well, one, to educate, right? I want individuals to know that they're not alone, and to know that OCD is a bit more common than expected when you're battling it without a diagnosis. It's absolutely terrifying. But two, I love treating athletes that want to develop the love for their sport again. I know OCD often attacks the things that we love and care about. So for me, it was always worse around race time because I loved my sport. I loved competing. I loved running, and it really took that love away, and I kind of became a prisoner to it. And so when my OCD got in the right place, that love came back. And so I really have a passion about helping other people know that they can redevelop that love again too, if anxiety took it away.
Wonderful. Well, Cali, anything else that I have not asked you today?
I'll just leave with a message, in that evidence-based care works, and that if some of these symptoms hit home for individuals, there are so many resources out there. And I know that the journey to getting appropriate treatment can be a bumpy one, but not to give up. You're not alone, and use those resources.
I love that message. Thank you, Cali. I appreciate it. It was wonderful having you today.
I had so much fun. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.